And last but not least is I will invite Mr. Peter Cunliffe-Jones, who is a researcher at the University of Westminster, founder of Africa First fact-checking organization. Africa Check, a member of the advisory board of the International Fact-Checking Network and advisor to Arab fact-checkers networks as well. In his lightning talk about unleashing the potentials, Peter hopefully will suggest 3 questions to test why the misinformation, why do we check the misinformation, why it really matters around the world with individuals, with organizations and states, as they are all making false claims all the time. Some falsehood make no real difference to real life. Others have catastrophic effect. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Shukran. Hello. When colleagues and I set up Africa Check in 2012, we approached a lot of donors for funding. And when we did so, often the first question that they needed me to answer was, what is the problem that you want us to help you solve? Today, and to me at the time, the answer seems to be obvious. But to them, there were, and there still are, lots of problems around the world, from education to healthcare to homelessness to gender violence. There's a very long list. And after several applications, funding applications went unanswered, I realized that in order to win support, we needed to be better able to answer the question, what does the misinformation that we are fact-checking do? What does it really matter? We can't fact-check every claim. We can't fact-check everything that is wrong on the internet or elsewhere, in parliament, in media, in community settings. We just can't do it. To edit, and I come from a background in journalism, to edit is to choose, is to select. But if we want to choose what matters, do we actually know what that is? How do we check, as Jihad was saying, the check-worthiness of a claim? How do we know what that is? People disagree. The answer that many of us give, and I've spoken to a lot of fact-checkers in the last 10 years about this, is that we select claims to check that we think are probably wrong and that have gone viral. As a former journalist myself, it makes sense to me that we focus on claims that we think have the biggest audience. At the same time, the fact that a claim has a large audience doesn't necessarily mean it has a large effect. For the first 3 years, perhaps 4 years of Africa Check's existence, the report we had that had the biggest audience was about the question of how many countries there are in Africa. We got a very large audience for this report, but the question was essentially geopolitical theory. What's a country? Nobody's life changed because of the answer that we gave to the claim around that. I stepped down from Africa Check in 2019, and over the past 4 years, I've focused on the question of the nature of the harm that misinformation causes and doesn't cause. And to summarize the findings, I identified 3 broad types of effect. First is that many claims have what I can only describe as either no effect or limited effect. The effect, if people believe the claims, which quite often they don't, is limited to a false understanding. There's no substantive real-world effect. The second is what I call meta-misinformation effect. That's meta-misinformation in the terms of the Greek word, not the corporation. The broad effect on society of a corrosive lack of trust caused by repeated exposure or perceived repeated exposure to misinformation in general, so nobody trusts anything at all, and false claims that accurate information is fake news, as a former American president used to say. The third type of effect, so no effect, meta-misinformation effect, lack of trust, is specific consequences caused when particular types of misinformation in particular circumstances create or reinforce a particular false understanding. And that false understanding is what causes harm. The question that I had back in 2019, it was one of the editors at Africa Check who asked me this question of how do we choose, out of all the claims that there are, how do we choose what is check-worthy, as Jihad said? The question I had is, can we understand what are the factors that mean that a particular piece of misinformation might cause only limited effect, a false understanding at best, or contribute to the broader effects of meta-misinformation, or cause a real specific harm? If we can do that, we can help ensure, and we can help prove to our followers, to our supporters, to ourselves, to our donors, that our work actually matters. To answer that question, I built a database of 250 examples of misinformation and observed effects that ran from harm to individuals' health through to abuse and violence and civil unrest. Doing the research taught me a lot of valuable lessons. The first was never agree to build a database. Never agree to do this yourself. It's a massive amount of work. Use somebody else's if you possibly can. The second and more positive finding was that by studying the factors common to claims that did cause specific effects and findings of claims that did not, I identified 3 questions that I think fact-checkers need to ask. Regulators, fact-checkers, others need to ask. The first is the claim seen or likely to be seen as sufficiently true by a sufficient number of people to cause a harmful effect? This differs depending on the claim. The second is, if people do believe the claim to be true, is the claim in fact sufficiently false? Are we nitpicking? Are we just going to a very narrow element of inaccuracy in the claim? Or is it sufficiently false to cause a substantively false understanding? And the third is, okay, so the claim is true. So the audience believe the claim is true, but it is substantively false. It creates a substantively false understanding. Does the audience have the capacity and the motivation to do anything about it that's going to make a difference in the real world? How you do this is more complicated than I can discuss in 8 minutes, and I've got 1 minute more, I see. But let me illustrate this with these questions. Well, let me illustrate why these questions matter with some examples, briefly. So first, in most cases, people need to believe a claim to at least some degree in order to act on it in a way that causes harm. No, not there. There we go. Okay. On the left is a false claim that apricot seeds are a cure for cancer. If just one person believes this false claim and acts on it, it could cause harm, because eating too many apricot seeds can kill you. Evidence showed that people believed the claim. It had a clear potential to cause practical harm. On the right is a false claim making a political point about a soldier in Nigeria. Turns out, in fact, that the soldier shown is from Democratic Republic of Congo. People can see this because he's speaking a language called Lingala, which is not spoken in Nigeria. Nobody believed it. And in order for it to have had effect, you'd have to have a political effect. You'd have had to have persuaded a lot of people. The second claim, the second question, is the understanding substantively false? So both of these claims are inaccurate, but one of them is substantively false. The first was the claim that the Nigerian president actually died in 2017, and he'd been buried at that time, and that the Western media had covered this up as part of some conspiracy. He'd been replaced by a lookalike that undermined the legitimacy of the government. it was completely false. He finished his second term in 2023. The second claim on the right is inaccurate. It's a photograph of a shop that was burned out in disturbances in Nigeria. That shop was burned out in 2015. The claim spread in 2019. The photo was old, but the understanding of what had happened was true. Those sorts of events had happened. The third question, third of three questions, is can you do anything about your false understanding? So the first example, a false claim about Hillary Clinton that spread in 2019 in South Africa. In 2019, nobody in South Africa had a vote on Hillary Clinton. I mean, to be frank, in 2016, very few people did. If you have a false understanding about this matter, you have a false understanding. There's very little you can do about it that is substantive. The second claim, turmeric is a cure for cancer. This is something that you could do something about it at that time as an individual. You can go out and buy turmeric. The third point is that the third example is a false claim that spread in 2019 about the popularity of politicians in Kenyan elections. The Kenyan elections were not happening for 3 more years. If I believed this at that time, there was nothing in practice I could do about it. But if it builds into a false narrative, it's why fact-checkers need to look at narratives, it could affect my view in 3 years' time. So, last point, because I see I am over time. There are lots of reasons to fact-check claims. It is not simply about understanding the veracity of the claims. There are many effects that fact-checking has which are very often not properly understood. But understanding misinformation's potential to cause harm or not to cause harm is fundamentally important. Later this year, I'm going to be having the pleasure of working on a small trial with colleagues at 3 fact-checking organizations, trying to see if we can apply in practice this model to the work that fact-checkers do. If we do that, it gives us reason to protect freedom of speech, freedom of the media, who make mistakes, get things wrong that do not matter, and focus our work on claims and work that harms. I hope it helps what the community does. Shukran.
Thank you, Peter.